Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us. I know the past times people have been joining very early in the morning or very late at night, and then also during the summer. So thank you all for joining. We're very excited. This is the last of our series that is hosted by Division 15 of APA, the Race and Diversity Committee. And we um, we'll have some reminders at the end, but stay tuned for more upcoming events, even though this is the end of the series. But this is our series, Understanding Anti-Racist and Anti-Colonial Approaches to Research. And we have soon to be Dr. Macy Bowman, who will present about sharing circles, an Indigenous method. And I will turn it over to Dr. Chen to announce her. Sorry, one quick announcement for how this will go. Please try to stay muted throughout it. If you're unmuted, I'll mute you. It'll be just so that we can move along smoothly. If you have any questions throughout the session, please feel free to put those messages in the chat. If it's a clarifying question, we can get those answered, and then we'll wait for like bigger questions till the end, but definitely put them in the chat once they come to mind, and we'll keep track of those to make sure that questions get answered, and we'll have time at the end of this session to answer those. But I'll turn it over for real this time to Dr. Chen to introduce soon to be Dr. Bowman.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. We are so excited to have Macy Bowman here with us today to share her expertise on sharing circles. Macy Bowman is a PhD candidate in educational psychology at Pennsylvania State University. She is Wolastoqey from Tobique, First Nations in Eastern Canada. Her scholarship focuses on using mixed methods and indigenous methods to explore belonging, motivation, and culturally relevant pedagogy. In particular, she works with her indigenous community to support tribal sovereignty in education and to create and sustain equitable learning environments for indigenous students. So welcome and thank you so much, Macy, for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you for your presentation.
Awesome. Okay. Let me share my screen, everyone. Get here and share. Okay. And where is the present button? Here we go. There we go. Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Macy Bowman. I am a PhD student at Penn State University. I am from Tobique First Nations, and I'm a Wolastoqey from that tribal nation. Today, we're going to be talking about sharing circles and how story is knowledge, honoring Indigenous epistemologies through that. We're going to talk a little bit about our Indigenous R's of research. I'm going to give you guys an example. We're going to do some get to know yous a little bit, and it's going to be hopefully a really fun time today. Wooly Gizzy Busquay, no was Macy, no Ignell State College, Pennsylvania, no Jayao Nagokuk, no Wolastoqey. That's just my introduction in my Wolastoqey language, saying good afternoon. My name is Macy. I live in State College, and I'm from Tobique First Nations, the Wolastoqey tribe. Okay. Like I said, we're going to run through the R's of Indigenous research. We're going to talk about what are sharing circles, and then I'm going to give you an example from the work that I'm currently doing and currently finishing up. I want to start. I know everyone is in their own respective places, at their own houses, and on their own campuses. But specifically here at Penn State, we have a land acknowledgement that was developed by our Indigenous Peoples Association, our student and our faculty. And so the Pennsylvania State University campuses are located. They are a land grant university located on the original homelands of the Erie, Haudenosaunee, Seneca, Keosha, Onondaga, Oneida, Mohawk, and Tuscarora, Lenape, Delaware Nation, Delaware Tribe, Stockbridge, Munsee, Shawnee, Absentee Eastern and Oklahoma, Susquehanna, Gwatazi, Osage Nations. And as a land grant institution, we acknowledge and honor the traditional caretakers of these lands, and we strive to understand and model their responsible stewardship. We also acknowledge the longer history of these lands that is our place in that history. And so understanding that the lands that we are on, that Penn State has, are originally these indigenous nations. And although Pennsylvania does not have any tribal or federally recognized tribes, this land did come from somewhere and it is theirs. So I always like to start with that, and I encourage everyone to do research at their own institutions or in their own homelands or where they live to see, where does that land come from, and just to get the origin of that and be respectful of that. So I always like to start with a little introduction slide because I'm just awesome like that. But like I said, my name is Macy. I have some pictures of my dogs. I have three dogs, Metro, Paradise, and Charlotte. They're all free to a new home because they are annoying me so much lately. Just kidding. I love them. This aerial shot behind my photos is actually, it's not the best quality, but this is my reservation that I live on or that I grew up on and that I'm from. It's Tobic First Nations. We border the water, so Wolastoqey actually means the people of the beautiful and bountiful river. And on two sides of our reservation, we are surrounded by the Wolastoqey. I also have a picture of my husband and I. We got married a couple years or a year ago while I was in grad school. And then on January 1st, New Year's Day, we had our beautiful baby girl, Clara. This picture all the way on the right is her in her first ribbon skirt at a powwow. And if you're not familiar with powwows, it is a cultural celebration in Indigenous cultures. Specifically in my Wolastoqey culture, powwows are really important and they're something that are celebrated. We usually have all of our babies that are born in that year go to powwows to get their naming ceremonies. And Penn State actually has a powwow on campus every year, and so that is where Clara is at. So I like to start with that. I want to know who you are. This is my first time using Menti, everyone, so I need to get out of my presentation and open it up. But I would love if everyone could just say your name, where you're from, and just an interesting fact about you or anything that you want to share with us. Um, so I think if you just go to menti.com and use the code, you can answer and your your answers will show up on here. So I'll give you a couple minutes to do that if you don't mind. Make it a little bit more fun. Oops, there we go. Ooh, martial artist. Congratulations, Sarah, on finishing your PhD. Ooh, and Susie starting a PhD program. Annie, I want to go to BC so bad. Counseling psychologist. Ooh, coding and robotics. That's really interesting. My husband is a software engineer and he loves AI and coding and stuff. Yay. And STEM. California. I'm going out to Irvine actually in September. My best friend lives in SoCal. Yay! Okay. This is so fun. I love getting to know the people that I'm talking to and talking with. It's really important to me to get to know everyone, even if it's just a small blurb on a mentee. But I have another one. I have a couple others that I want to just start the presentation with and frame it with. I want to know, what is research? What do you think research is? How would you define research in your own epistemology, your own frame of mind, your own ways of knowing? You don't have to write a paper or a paragraph, just a few words, or a sentence or two. Yes, collaboration, absolutely. Understanding, rigorous, form curiosity, search for truth, exploration. Oh, they're so good. Yay, I love it. Listening, yes, research is all of these things. Listening, understanding, rigorous, collaboration, innovation. This is really good, and we'll dive in when we talk about the Indigenous R's about what research is to Indigenous people. Wonder, connection. I love connection, reciprocity. We'll be talking a lot about that today. Yay, amazing. Okay, and then I'm going to use guys one more time. We have one more. What does research mean to you specifically? Especially in Indigenous epistemology and just in my own growing up as a holistic way, research and the connection you have to research and the connection you have to your passions is just so important. And it's why you do what you do. So, kind of like, what does research mean to you, or what is your why? Why are you doing this? Why are you going through a PhD? You can just add a few words for that, and then we'll jump into the presentation. It's about understanding perspectives and lived experiences of social systems. Absolutely. Love this. A tool for gaining knowledge to support the community. Research holds power, which enables opportunities to advocate for others and promote social justice, especially in education psychology. Yes, absolutely. Research is to explore and find the meaning of my learning journey. I love that. Yes. Critical knowledge not always gained from simply being in community. Absolutely. I think it takes stepping outside the community to be able to understand and get that different perspective, that insider outsider. Research builds empathy and compassion when done well. Yes. Sharing circles is definitely a method, and we're obviously going to talk, that's what this presentation is on today, that requires a lot of empathy and compassion and relationship building. Toggle over here. Oh, Annie, I just saw your message. Please come visit. I want to come visit. Hey, okay. Well, I'm going to get out of here somehow. There we go. Okay. And go over to our presentation. And Yin, Corey, and Charlotte, if you need me, just talk because I can't see the chat anymore when I'm in my presentation. I somehow deleted it. Okay. So let's start. And we're good. Everyone can see that, right?
Yep, all
Okay,
good.
sweet. Awesome. Well, we're jump right in. Thank you guys for participating. I know it's a Friday afternoon and we're all tired. I know I'm definitely going to get a coffee after this, so I really appreciate it. We're going to dive right in and talk about the 6 R's of Indigenous research. So the 6 R's of Indigenous research has really like originated from all types of different things, all types of different cultures, all types of different indigenous tribal nations. At the end of this presentation, I know some people had put for their questions like wanting to know some of like the research and like the literature so that they could go check it out. I do have a reference list, but specifically for the 6 R's of Indigenous research, I draw a lot from Linda T. Waugh Smith's Decolonizing Indigenous Methodologies book. We have Wilson's Research as Ceremony. And then the Toysey and all is actually an article specifically on the 6 R's of Indigenous research. So I'm going to jump right in here. We're going to first start with relationships. Each picture or each slide has a picture as a background, and this picture I think relates back to what we're kind of talking about. In Indigenous culture, we have relationships is extremely important, and I'm talking all of this from I want to just place contextual or to contextualize it. I'm Wolastoqey from Eastern Canada. I am talking and representing a lot of the knowledges that I grew up with, and that does not mean that every Indigenous person thinks this way. Every Indigenous culture is this way. We do have similarities. We have what's called peoplehood, where we do and we have faced a lot of similar things. That does not mean that our culture is exactly the same. So I just want to give that disclaimer. But this picture is of the Wolastoq. This is the Wolastoq River. It actually has been renamed to the St. John River. The name has been stolen. It has and always will be the Wolastoq River, which means the people of the beautiful and bountiful river. And so relationships in Indigenous methodologies, there's a lot of different components to it. We look at relationships as a space to before you even start the research, before you even really get into a community, it's all about relationships. So for example, working with my community, I am an insider to my community, but I have built relationships with community members and elders and education coordinators and directors of eds and school systems because I've lived there because I'm part of the community. But in my work, I've actually expanded outside of that to now go with other communities and work alongside them and building those relationships of staying in contact, emailing, Facebook messaging, phone calls, text messages, something about relationships. And I think sometimes it's hard in educational psychology and then just in the field of research in general, is that we think that there's only one way to typically communicate, a Teams, a Zoom, or an email. And it kind of feels wishy-washy to get outside of that. I know for me, I definitely felt like, oh, am I overstepping by, texting or calling, but with relationships, we have to meet people where they're at and what their preferred form of communication is, and that requires that aspect of it. And I think building relationships really requires you to go to that community or work alongside that community and ask, what do you need? What is something that you want to work on? And not coming in like, hey, I want to do this, I want to do that. It's really establishing that rapport, and that may take and sometimes weeks, months, years to build those relationships. I know as a graduate student, it did get tough sometimes. I mean, we're only in graduate school. It seems like a long time, but when you look back, it's actually pretty quick for 5, 6 years. Um, and you're trying to get publications, you're trying to get projects done, you're trying to fulfill your milestones and doing research that involves really developing those relationships may seem like, oh, this is kind of a waste of time, or like, I just need to get this publication, or I just need to get that. And you look at your peers who maybe are doing research that is lab based or that is in their program or at their university, and you're like, oh, you're already done your study, you're already done your master's, and I'm still here building these relationships. But I'm telling you that these relationships, just like in any part of our lives, are so essential to creating good research partnerships and also to getting to know the community and the culture, and it's the foundation. The next R of Indigenous research is respect. Respect is something that in my culture is taught from the very beginning. You respect your elders, you respect those who are older than you respect their knowledges, and it's a little different than our mainstream research world where you look at like respect as in like, oh wow, that person has a lot of, they may have, a lot of degrees or titles, or they may be a distinguished professor, or they may have all of these awards and all of these things. But respect really comes from in Willisite culture, respecting your elders, those who come before you, your ancestors, those who've taken care of the land, those who've taken care of, the community. And respect in research can look a lot of different ways in Indigenous epistemology. A lot of it comes from, these are all interwoven R's. They're all together, like weaved like a basket, or even braided like a piece of sweetgrass here in the photo. But respect is essential for creating good and meaningful relationships with communities and and with participants. Respect is respecting tribal protocols. So when you work with a community, there are things that, and we're going to get more into this in the sharing circles portion, but there are things that, the community might ask of you that you need to respect, whether that be a prayer or a smudging ceremony or something along those lines. And so having that respect is really essential. When doing research in any paradigm, but specifically when engaging in Indigenous methodologies. We also have the respect of data sharing. So when if you are given permission to share, the research that you're doing or some projects, making sure that that is approved, and that is respectful of the community, respecting the land. And this is also brought up in relationships as well, but our relationship to land is super important. As Willistook people specifically, we are people of the water. We are caretakers of the water, caretakers of our land. And as I've stated with the land acknowledgement, our land has been taken from us in many ways. And so we really deeply respect that. And so when you step foot in a community, it's really important that you're respecting their land and their community as well. Okay. Relevance. Relevance is another one that sometimes doesn't seem as obvious. I know for me, it took a while for me to completely understand what relevance really meant, but it's basically just like going into that community or creating those relationships with that community and asking what they need and instead of like what you think they need. So you could have a research project all drawn up on your head and something that you want to do, but is it truly something that is relevant to the community and that they want to do, or is it something that is pushing for your agenda, or because you need this milestone met, or because you want this publication, or because this is your research interest? Um, an example of this is when I approached my community about working in the schools and working alongside our students. I asked them, I said, this is something I'm interested in, but what is it that you need? What is it that you really want for your community? What is something that you want to know? And I gave them my skill set of what I kind of knew and know how to do and what I was interested in. And it just happened that a lot of our interests aligned, and that we were able to make them align more. But there has been cases where they've asked for things that are not necessarily my expertise, but I've went and I've studied and I've learned and I've tried my best to really support that. Something that I'm currently working on with my communities is wellness. Um, as an educational psychologist and in my program, I've really focused more on belonging and academic achievement and motivation. And now I'm kind of getting into the space of what does wellness look like? What does an Indigenous wellness framework look like? And how do we support and how do we tailor interventions that are already out there, like socio-emotional learning interventions and things like that? How do we tailor that to an Indigenous lens? And so it's just really important that when you're working with the community, you're truly respecting and doing what they need and what they want. And if it's not something that you have an expertise in, providing them with the resources or finding someone who could help them is just as great and just as good. Um, Fourth, responsibility. There comes a lot of responsibility with doing this type of work. The first one is, and I mentioned this previously a little bit, but keeping the data safe, something that when working with Indigenous methods, sharing circles with Indigenous populations and things like that, is ensuring that one, you're keeping your participants safe, of course, from an ethical standpoint and from an IRB standpoint, but also making sure that anything that is shared is not sacred knowledge that doesn't need to be shared. A lot of our traditions and our treaties and our laws and our governance are oral. They're oral traditions, they're stories, and they're not meant to be written down, they're not meant to be recorded. That same goes with a lot of our songs. At powwows, which this photo is taken from a powwow, we don't have people record or take photos of our honor song. That is something that is not meant to be written down or recorded. So you have a huge responsibility to keep the data safe. And sometimes this can be tough when you are publishing and the community has given you the permission to publish. I know a lot of journals now, want access to the data for transparency and openness and things like that. And sometimes that's just not possible with Indigenous data. That data needs to be protected. And at most, the data that you produce when working with Indigenous populations is owned by that community. So any research that I do is owned by the Wolastoqey, is owned by my community and the surrounding communities. And I'm just a steward of that. And so it's important that I respect and I'm responsible for that. And then also, of course, keeping like our participants' identity safe. There is a lot of lateral violence that occurs in the communities. And we'll get more into this with sharing circles on how to get participants to participate and want to participate, but keeping their identity and what they say safe is really, really important. Okay. Representation. This photo is from the Tobic powwow that's held every year. And this photo specifically is a round dance, and it is where everyone from the community, whether you're a dancer or not, you see there's one woman here in the pink. She's in full regalia. She is a fancy shawl dancer. And then you have one woman here who's in just a ribbon skirt. And then you have some people who are just attending the powwow. But what a round dance does is it brings everyone together, brings everyone in community, and it really shows and represents the culture and who we are as a holistic people. That community and that collective success is really, really important and the foundation for that. And so representation and research just means by using Indigenous methods, by using sharing circles, we're bringing this method to academia. So to give a little story, when I first started my PhD journey, I actually went to undergrad at the University of Georgia, and I was working in like cogn. I was looking for a position. I was a psychology major, and I was looking for a lab position, something to do. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. Psychology, there's a lot of different avenues you can go down, and so I started working with someone at UGA, and he did cognitive development and things like that in cognitive science, and I was like, wow, this is really cool, and I love this, and I did that for a couple of years. And then once it got time for me to apply for programs, I thought, you know what? I think I want to do educational psychology. Well, then I got to where I am now, to Penn State, and I got in at Penn State and I started working with my advisor. His name is Matt, and he worked in New Zealand for the last 10 years, or for the previous 10 years at that point with the Maori. And he was talking about, the indigenous people that he knew and everything. And it almost was like a light bulb went off. I never really connected my heritage, my community, my culture, who I was to then like what I was doing in my work and what I could do in my career. And that's when I started going down the rabbit hole of Indigenous in education, Indigenous education, and Indigenous educational psychology, things like that. And there really wasn't much, and there still isn't much in our field of ed psych. I've seen a lot in like curriculum instruction, higher ed, things like that, as we're moving more towards decolonization of those spaces. And by using these methods and by utilizing indigenous methods and sharing circles, things like that, we're really bringing light to that. And so, I found research and I went down this rabbit hole one summer of just reading all of the indigenous methods books, a lot of which are cited in this presentation. And I thought, I want to do that in my field because I want people to be able to know what that is. And so, it definitely wasn't the easiest battle as a graduate student, bringing something that was definitely very different into our space that has been predominantly, um, sorry, I don't know why that goes there, predominantly quantitative and things like that. But I think something that's really beautiful about this work is that just bringing it into that space, and having that representation and showing what it can look like in this space. And I think that helps, from that work, I've done numerous conversations and had numerous talks with people and have been able to mentor a few students. And I think by bringing that in, we're just really giving that representation that's needed in the space. And I think the next one is my favorite. Yes, my favorite, reciprocity. Again, this is a photo from the powwow a couple years ago, of the community doing the round dance. We have several cute little kiddos, in their full regalia. We have elders and community members, but reciprocity is essential for this work. Whether that be, there's a couple different types of reciprocity. Um, One thing that I always make sure in all of the work that I do is offering a gift or token of gratitude. And in my community, sharing a meal together is something that is always done over any important meeting, gathering, event. And so to show reciprocity for, students sharing their stories with me, or youth sharing their stories, or even communities just willing to give me to have a conversation with me, I'm always either buying them food, or having a meal at the place of research. Also, just the reciprocity of sharing back and forth. I know a lot of my work, sense of belonging, it can be tough to talk about, no one wants to say out loud that they don't belong, or that they feel like an outcast, or that they don't feel like they're part of the group, or no one wants to talk about, your struggles with everyone. It can be embarrassing. And that reciprocity of having myself also share my stories, and share my knowledge as an act of like, here, this is what I have to give to the conversation, and would you please share as well, is just really important, and is just absolutely essential for this type of work. Okay, yeah, I thought I was at the end at 6. I want to take some time for some questions if anyone has any clarifying questions, if anybody has some questions just about the Indigenous arts in general. And I can answer a few before we jump into an example and really what sharing circles is. Whoops. Just leave it there for now. I love the idea of reciprocity. Sharing stories. I often. Yes. Okay. So Sarah asked, and thank you, Corey, for your comment as well. I totally understand that. You mentioned lateral violence. I've only heard about this in the context of workplace satisfaction. Could you share how you understand it in this context? So maybe I'll just go back to this. Our youth in our community experience a lot of lateral violence, and and our adults as well. But the way that I understand lateral violence, and that I've seen it and have experienced it, is um our community is a mix of a lot of different people. So we do have quite a few community members have married non-Indigenous people, who have then had children, like or have married, like my parents, they were both 50% Indigenous. And so if you look at me walking down the street, you don't automatically think, oh, wow, that's an Indigenous person. And there has been a lot of lateral violence on, are you Indigenous enough? Or why don't you look Indigenous? That is something that our students and our youth have really struggled with as, people are leaving the community or marrying outside of the community, or we just have lighter skin in general. And so we've seen a lot of lateral violence that way. We have lateral violence among our like adult population, whether that be in the community with jobs, with health struggles. We do and we have had issues with drug abuse and getting help for that. And so I think we have seen it a little bit in the work satisfaction, or sorry, what did it exactly say? Um, in the workplace satisfaction. But for the most part, I've seen it at the youth level, specifically like among Indigenous students. And then how it affects research. I think where I've seen it, and the context I'm working with is I've worked with middle and high school students, which is sometimes can be a very tough age. And I have noticed it as when we're getting to these sharing circles, in some instances, this has not happened a lot. There's a lot of lateral violence among students, and when they go to share vulnerable things, then those students use it against them. And that is something that's really tough and why when we start a sharing circle, we always talk about our guidelines and how, we don't share what's said outside of this circle, that, when we walk into this space, we're talking here, this is what we're talking about, but then when we leave this space, we're not going to use that against other people in that group. And so I'm not super well versed in lateral violence. I've actually just been doing a little bit of consulting work in it to help out the community, but I would love to learn more. So yeah. Thank you. Thank you. And anyone else? I can maybe one or two more and then we'll get going. If not, we can just chug along. Sweet. Okay, we'll just move right along then. Yay. Okay. Let me start my presentation back up. There we go. Sharing circles. So what this webinar is truly about. I'm so excited. I love sharing circles. I will use the term sharing circles and talking circles interchangeably. Sharing circles is what I've seen in the literature on when I've like deep dived into this. In my community, we've always called them talking circles, essentially the same thing, just a different name. So I do want to just make that distinction. So what is a sharing circle? A sharing circle is an open, structured, conversational style methodology that shows respect for the participant's story sharing within a tribal protocol context. And what this means is that it's very flexible. It is a conversation. We're talking back and forth, the researcher and the participants. It's not just I'm asking you questions. It's let's really have a conversation and talk about it. Let's share our stories. Let's have a guidelines for respectful sharing, and then also let's make sure that we're always including our tribal protocol, and that is different among different groups of tribes. Something that is really important with a sharing circle is we all sit in a circle, which is designed to promote trust, inclusivity, equality, and respect in holistic way culture specifically. I've never done a sharing circle on Zoom and I don't know how that would work. I think it can be done. I think that obviously you cannot sit in a circle on Zoom, but I think there are ways to do it. However, being with the students or with your participants right then and there and sitting in that circle and being able to see everyone around you is really, really important. A lot of, specifically in Willistic Way culture, a lot of our meetings are always like our government meetings. So in my community, we have what's called a chief and a council. A chief would be like, I don't know, like the president, or the prime minister, and the council would be like the Senate. And they all have a vote and they all have a say on things. And even within those meetings, they're always oriented in a circle. Our powwow, for example, our powwow grounds is always in a circle to promote inclusivity, quality, and respect. Something that I will share a little bit later on is how I orient my themes for my project. And that is oriented in a medicine wheel, which is a circle. And the medicine wheel has four different components. We have the mental, the spiritual culture, we have the physical, the emotional, and each quadrant, and that is in a circle, and to promote that inclusivity. Um, Something that also is really important, and actually, someone I think wrote it on the What is Research connection, by sharing their experiences. So, participants, by sharing their experiences and listening to others, participants can gain a better understanding of each other, build relationships, and offer support. And sharing circles also provide a space for personal growth and healing, as participants are encouraged to reflect on their experiences and gain insight into their thoughts and feelings. And so, sharing circles are not just a space to share stories or to gather research information, but they're truly a place to heal. They're used a lot in our culture camps, in our rehab facilities, in our um, like AA meetings and things like that. Being in that circle and sharing is really important to build, and participants really are able to listen and provide support and understand each other. Um, and something that is also specific to Wolastoqey culture is we always have a talking stick. And so we pass that around and everyone gets a chance to share. And if you're not comfortable in sharing, you can say all my relations. And that means that we just pass you on to the next person. And if they would like to share. And I think this really helps people not feel so pressured in that space, like the awkward silence or, what do I do kind of thing. And so that's really important. Sharing circles versus focus groups. This is a debate that I had in my journey in research. I was urged to use focus groups um, mostly from the lack of not knowing what a sharing circle was. And so I don't blame people for that. If you don't know, you don't know what you don't know. And I always share this story. I read this, I believe it's in Linda Tiwa Smith's Decolonizing Methodologies book, but or she's the one that shared the story, but it was put into Research a Ceremony. And it's basically the story of there's this grandfather, or I forget if it was a wolf or an owl or someone. Someone was, or I think it was a man. He was looking for his moccasin broke, so his shoe, his moccasin got ripped or whatnot, and so he needed to stitch it back up before he can continue on his journey. So he's looking for his moccasin. He has this big bright fire that's illuminating. It's at night, so it's dark out, but he has this beautiful fire. And so he's just going around the fire. Like, where's my moccasin needle? I need to fix my moccasin. He can't find it anywhere. He's looking for hours. And then an owl comes down and he goes, "Hey, dude, like, what are you doing? You need some help?" And he goes, "Yeah, like my moccasin broke and I can't continue on my journey. Like, I need my moccasin. I need my needle so I can fix it." And the owl goes, "Well, where did you lose it?" And the guy goes, "Oh, like I lost it like a couple yards away. I think like I don't know. I noticed like 5 minutes ago, like 5 minutes down the trail." And the owl goes, "Well, why are you circling around the fire looking for your like moccasin needle if you knew that you lost it like 500 feet down the road or whatnot?" And he goes, "Well, because it's warm, it's bright, and I can see here." And this example illustrates that when we think about something, when we're stuck in a paradigm or we're always using the same a certain method or whatnot, we're always want to stay close to home or want to stay where that warmth is. We want to be under that blanket, or we don't think to look outside the box, to look outside where we're uncomfortable or we don't know. And so I always share that with this because that was something that I went through with people in my work in general. Was I wanted to use sharing circles, but focus group is what people knew and what people were comfortable with. And so it took a lot of this is really what a sharing circle is, and this is why it benefits me rather than a focus group, and really having to fight for that. And so, a few tenets of sharing circles versus focus groups. Sharing circles are always going to respect tribal protocol. It is inherent in the methodology to respect tribal protocol, and we'll get more into what tribal protocol is. Focus groups, that is not, they can respect tribal protocol, but that is not a necessity for their methodology. Sharing circles is really built upon relationships and specifically prior relationships. Having relationships with your participants or with people to actually put on the work that you're doing is really, really important. And I know firsthand, I when I did my project, I did sharing circles at 12 different schools in 5 different communities. And I definitely would say I felt the most comfortable in my own community with people that I knew. I did a sharing circle. Actually, my little sister was in the sharing circle. She was in 7th grade at the time. Um, and having even just that prior relationship to be like, for I was a trusted person now to her friends because she knew me, really, really helped. In focus groups, they actually encourage no prior relationship. You want to be objective. You want to be far away from your participants. In sharing circles, you are part of the circle. So you are expected to share, you are expected to be part of that, you're expected to be vulnerable, and you're expected to share your experiences. And I'll get more into that as well. And then a sharing circle is a place of mutual healing. It's a space where there is years and years and years of trauma and, Indian residential schools, boarding schools, land removals. There is so much intergenerational trauma in our communities, and a sharing circle, a chance to be heard and listened to fully, is a place of mutual healing. Rather, a focus group is more for a place to gather information. And then again, with sharing circles, we are in a circular orientation. And again, I think I haven't done it on Zoom yet, but I think there are ways to potentially achieve that. Whereas a focus group, you can be in any orientation. I think typically people do, naturally sit in a circle though. So we're gonna jump in. Just check the chat. Okay. We're gonna jump in to Indigenous students' sense of school belonging. So this is just an example of how I utilize sharing circles and what really got me into utilizing this methodology in my own work. Okay. So I just want to give a little background. Why an Indigenous school belonging? So my work has focused on school belonging because when I was a student in middle school, an Indigenous student, and I was in a school that was um, off reservation. So in my context, we only have an elementary school on our reservation, but then we have to go about 15 minutes outside of our community to go to middle and high school. When I made that transition to go to middle school, it was tough because you're used to being with all of your Indigenous peers close to home in your community, and then that's ripped away when you have to go to middle school. And we all know middle school in general sucks. And so there's a lot of different things going on there. And so in that space, like why an Indigenous school belonging, I went to my community and I said, hey, like I had these experiences of really having a hard time in middle school and high school and not feeling like I belonged. When I was in middle and high school, that was probably in 2011 to 2013, I was in middle school. We had, as Indigenous students, had to ride a separate bus than our non-Indigenous friends. We had to eat in a separate room as them. We had a separate space to go. There are a lot of stereotypes that we were considered bad, and like not well-behaved children. Like people would use the term savages sometimes. And so I went to my community and I said, I've been experiencing this. Has this been something that is still happening today? Because it's fast forward 10 years, what is going on? And they said, actually, we're really struggling with school belonging in our schools because of the political climate or whatever it is, land removals in the community or whatnot, or of the community. And so I went to them and I said, how could I help? And they were like, we would love to identify ways to assess school belonging, ways to promote it. We would love to have more of a tribal sovereignty in education. We'd like to have more power over our education. Something specific to my communities is there are agreements that are between the communities and the school districts where there is money involved, and there are agreements that, hey, you need to be making sure that you're providing a space for Indigenous students that is welcoming, and there's just no way to measure that. So I had that part of kind of my why, my passion, this is what my community wants. And then I looked to the literature and realized, huh, there's not much on school belonging for Indigenous students. And if there is, they're using measures that were created based on white normative populations for our Indigenous students. And I thought, I feel like there's a disconnect there that Indigenous students might experience belonging differently. And then I looked into like Carlton Fong's work. He worked a little bit on this. He identified ways at the post-secondary level, um, and how those like belonging factors may be different and things like that. And that led to schools should be accommodating and not assimilating. Um, I'm sorry, this is a little bit of a heavy topic, but Indian residential schools, they're known as Indian residential schools in Canada, but we call them Indian boarding schools over here in the US. You know, the slogan "Kill the Indian and the Child." For I think in Canada, yeah, the last residential school was closed in 1997, which is really in the grand scheme of things not that long ago, and there's a lot of intergenerational trauma from those policies and those schools. So essentially what Indian residential schools did where they were assimilation. They forcibly separated Indigenous children from their families. They brought them far away from their reservations to go to school, to be white, to be European. So they were not allowed to speak their languages. They're not allowed to participate in culture traditions. Boys, in my community have long hair. That is a tradition that has been upkept for many years. They were required to cut their hair. They were required to wear different clothes. They were subjected to emotional, physical, psychological, and even sexual abuse. And even as young as like my grandmother was in an Indian residential school. And I remember her sharing a story like, you know, when they had to get like dental work done or any kind of surgery, like any kind of like procedure, like they weren't allowed to use anesthesia on those children, like they had to suffer and things like that. And so, obviously, today in schools, we are not subjecting our students to that kind of physical abuse, but there are a lot of current school policies that discourage or prevent the use of Indigenous language and culture. And that's where going in and really working with the community to identify ways that that is happening or not happening or ways that we can help students feel a better sense of school belonging is the goal. So that was kind of another piece of the background. So with sharing circles and with this project, like I said, I worked with 5 different Wolastoqey communities across eastern New Brunswick. Um, and some of those communities were in more rural areas, and some of those communities were a little bit in more urban areas. And I worked with probably about 150 students total. In the sharing circles, we followed tribal protocol, which included we either had a community elder. Enhancement staff. So, an enhancement staff, their position in the schools is to is to have a space. So, that's usually a room or an office that is meant for Indigenous students. There's Indigenous language and culture all on the walls. There's food for them if they need any food. They provide emotional and also academic support to our students. And they're kind of like what I call like home away from home, and like the First Nations embassy at the school where First Nations can feel truly comforted and whatnot. Or we also have Indigenous support staff that can also be present. So no matter what, we always had either an elder, an enhancement staff, or Indigenous support staff present. There were a few times where neither of those were present, and that was because the students felt more comfortable if they were not there. And I let students make that decision. I let them have the autonomy over that. Another part of travel protocol that we followed each sharing circle, we started with a prayer in the language, or a smudging ceremony. A smudging ceremony is the burning of sage to cleanse the space, the mind. Um, this was tough sometimes with the smudging ceremony, a lot of schools, and this is an example of where policies are still assimilating in schools. They would not allow smudging ceremonies because of the smell of the burning sage, or they didn't want students to go outside for it. And so that was sometimes a barrier that we had to overcome. And then we always established sharing circle guidelines. So those included respect, talking one at a time, not interrupting, giving everyone the chance to speak if they wish, listening, active listening, not twiddling your thumbs or rolling your eyes or zoning out, but really listening to what people had to say. And then keeping what is said within the bounds of the circle. So, of course, in research, we're always identifiable information is always taking out, and sensitive topics. But for the students themselves, what students are being vulnerable about, it's not a space to go and share that with the world. That is to be kept within the circle. And then something that we also did throughout the entire project was discernment with the help of tribal staff to determine what should be and what should not be included in the research. And this project in general was actually created and it helped, I guess, do was with what's called the Wolastoqey Tribal Council, which they are a support group or organization that provides different types of support, whether that be physical, mental, spiritual, cultural to youth. And they have an education branch that oversees all of the Wolastoqey communities in Eastern New Brunswick. And so they were able to help build relationships and get working with the schools and also really helped as far as discernment on what should and not should be shared. So sharing circles, relationship building, and meal. So my favorite part, getting to know each other through conversations before beginning the sharing circle. So when we walked into sharing circles, I had someone from WTCI, Tribal Council, join me. We didn't just jump right in and start asking extremely vulnerable questions. We got to know the students. We kind of just chatted with them, shared our experiences a little bit. What are they up to? What grade are they in? What are they doing? And then we always offered a meal as a token of both gratitude and appreciation for their time, stories, and experiences, but also as a space to get to know them more. And I mean, what student doesn't love getting out of class and getting a free meal? I mean, what could not be better? And so we would share and talk and chat and eat. And I really felt like that was some of my favorite parts of the sharing circles, honestly, like was just really getting to know the students and, bringing them food and seeing them happy and appreciative and just like getting a chance to really just like chat with them. And so then once we did start the sharing circles, it was really important that I really tried to take off that research hat. So I did one of these sharing circles. It was my first one ever. It was my first time ever doing any kind of like research, data collection, and qualitative work because Indigenous sharing circles are more of a qualitative methodology. Um, I like went in there, like I dressed all up, and I knew all these things. Like I knew all of these like sharing circle, like trial protocols and everything. I dressed up, I like had my clipboard and my pen, I had my recorder, and I like walked in. And then I sat down and we did the meal and stuff, and then we started the sharing circle, and I just felt icky. I felt weird. And I was like, why am I feeling this way? Like, this is my job. Like, I'm a PhD student. Like, I do research. Like, I go to conferences. Like, I wear the name badge. And I realized in that moment that even though I knew what was right, I had been trained my whole entire life. In like an academic context that I need to be professional. I needed to, have my clipboard and be this and have my research hat on. And that really made me, it didn't sit well with me. And so I kind of had to go back and deconstruct everything that I really thought about research. And the next time I did a sharing circle, I showed up in plain clothes. I did not have a clipboard. I did not take notes. I just had my little, like the recording device. And I really immersed myself in the conversation. I didn't just share my stories. I didn't just ask questions. I really talked deeply about what I felt and how I felt in those experiences. And when I did that, not only did I feel better, but my participants felt better. We all just felt part of a community, it felt. And it like makes me tear up a little bit because like there were some very emotional conversations in the sharing circles, but I even had one student just come back afterwards, and you would never think that he would come after a sharing circle and talk. I mean, normally you think like the girls would maybe want to chat afterwards or whatnot, but it was this 11th grader, he was like too cool for school, like really cool dude, probably intimidated me a little bit, and he came up afterwards and he said, "Thank you so much for doing this. A space to get to just blow off steam and talk and to be really heard and listened to. Like this was so good for my mental health." And that really shaped just everything, why I do what I do. And from there on out, like, afterwards we'd have tons of students coming up like, when are you coming back? Like, can you come back and talk to us again? Like, can we just talk about any like it was really eye-opening. And so something that was really important with sharing circles is to always validate their experiences and actively listen. Don't listen and think about what you're going to say next. Don't listen and think how you're going to analyze this in the future. Don't listen and think, oh, that's a good one. Like, that's a really, really good one. Just listen. That's the best thing that you can do. And lastly, sharing circles, reciprocity within conversations. I share this photo. This was me and my research partner. We had a meeting with some enhancement staff at the schools, and this was in their Indigenous room. And in the background, it says Kwe Sigwan, which means welcome spring. And I thought this was just like a really beautiful photo to show like just being immersed in the space. And so what that means, reciprocity within conversations, is just kind of what I left off at the last slide with, is just really being vulnerable with your experiences and with your conversations and being willing to, these students, they're taking their time, these participants are taking their time to participate in your study, in your research, and you need to be vulnerable like they're being vulnerable with you. And I think it really opens up more space to talk and chat and really get to know, get to the core of that issue. And I think we're trained in research to be more objective and to kind of distance ourselves from that. And in sharing circles, that's not the case. We want to be right there with them. We want to be part of that conversation, and part of that ongoing story, that dialogue, that narrative. Oops, there we go. And then at the end, sharing circles, closing in gratitude. So something that's really important. And this can look different in every different community, but specifically for my community, Willistic Way, offering compensation for gratitude for school staff, elders, community members that assisted in the research. And so a lot of the time, this is offering medicines, offering a bag of tobacco or sage as a thank you for like helping us with this project, for being there, for recruiting students, for anything, and just offering that conversation. And then also on top of that meal, offering conversation to our students. So we made sure that that was something that was possible in the research. And then something that I think is really important that I've reflected on recently is closing the circle out on a positive note and sharing stories of the good times, if you will. And just making sure that when we're closing on a sharing circle out, that we're not, you know, at the edge of something really, really deep and vulnerable that's really hard to talk about. Rather, de-escalating from that, really providing some healing in that, and then ending on a good note. And this really ensures students had time to cool down and decompress before return to class or their daily activity. So my research is in the context of students, and so they're in school, they're doing these during school time. But I really made it a point that once it was done, I had the authority in my sharing circles at the schools to dismiss the students once we were finished. And I felt like it was really needed that we all kind of had like a little 10-minute decompress, chill out, relax. And so I always with the meal brought like dessert, like cookies or cupcakes or something. And so we'd save those for after the sharing circle and just a time to just breathe, let everything out. And then of course, at some point the students did have to return back to class, even though I'm sure they would have loved to stay with me the rest of the day because it was a blast. From the sharing circles on sense of belonging, and I didn't really talk about much in the previous slides, but from the sharing circles, we had 4 identified themes, relationships, language, history, and space. And then this trust and recognition that's on the outside of the circle is just weaved into each and every theme. Again, this is oriented in a medicine wheel that promotes inclusivity. It promotes the entanglement or the braiding and weaving of all of these themes that without one you can't really have the other. Um, and what's really fun about this research project is we identified these themes and then we went back to students and staff, WTCI staff, and just made sure that like from the data I thematically analyzed that the data was telling us what I thought it was telling us. And then from there, we identified items for a questionnaire that would relate to each theme. And then from there, we created a sense of belonging questionnaire and did exploratory factor analysis. And we're planning to do some more validation on that measure. And it was just really cool to be able to not only provide a space to listen and really help students in the moment, but then also gather this data and use it for something that can be used in the future and for these communities so that they can assess the schools that their students are going to and making sure that, hey, my students are feeling like they belong here, or hey, I think they need help in the language area, or I think the school could do a better job of relationship building or curriculum within history, things like that. And then these are my references, which I can somehow get them to all of you if you would like them. And lastly, just some questions. Thank you guys so much for sitting here on a Friday afternoon. I know it's 3 o'clock and people probably want to get going soon. So I just appreciate that you guys listen and that you participate in the beginning of the presentation. And like I said, any questions are welcome.
Thanks so much, Macy. This was wonderful and just, amazing slides. I loved all the imagery that you've used in your slides too. I think that just really brought us into the moment of what this work could look like and kind of its potential. And so now we'll have some time for questions. You can unmute to ask your question. You can drop it in the chat, kind of whatever. We're very flexible. And so I'll just give some space for audience members to ask questions. 'Cause I already have questions, but I don't want to take up the room just yet. So give you all a few moments. Sarah, why don't you ask one of your questions and then we can sort of transition back and forth so you don't feel like you're monopolizing, but we do want to give you some space to ask your questions. Okay. So um, Sarah kind of asked, she said, for some background, she comes from a Ukrainian ethnic minority, and they use storytelling and changing or evolving stories to reflect on the present. While I've used some of the method to help orient or ground collaborative experiences, but the full experience just doesn't sit or live in the same way here in the US. I'm curious to know what pieces of sharing circles have been generative in cultures where sharing looks different. Any thoughts about that, Macy?
Yeah, I mean, everything is context. So it is harder to bring something into a different context. And I really struggle with that with sharing circles is not a native to educational psychology space. Like ed psych is a very quantitative space that really looks at like, are you what you say you are? Are you being trustworthy? Like, where's the validity in this? And so I think the biggest thing that really helped me was just really diving deeper into the literature and really providing that background, but also showing what can come from that, showing how it is in its actual context. So bringing that sharing circle back into the Indigenous context and showing this is what the students are saying, and this is how it's making them feel, and this is how, like, look at what it's doing here, and then how can we now bring that to this space? And I've actually utilized sharing circles I've done some work in, which is very different from what I'm doing now, but library wellness, like how our like college and universities can libraries can promote student wellness as like a vessel for that because there's other spaces on campus that provides that. And so I actually utilized a version, I call it a version because I kind of like manipulated it a little bit of sharing circles into that space, even though it was not an indigenous space. And even just providing the principles of like being part of the circle and share and not being so objective and sitting in a circle and just being there and providing food and things like that, it really changes the game. It really changes the game. I felt like students really participated and wanted to be there, and it wasn't just like, oh, I'm here because I mean, I'm sure to some degree they're here because they're going to get compensation or whatnot, but it really felt like they wanted to be there and they weren't being forced. So I don't know if that captures some of your question, but I hope that helps a little bit. Welcome.
Thanks, Macy. That's helpful. And forgive me if I'm pronouncing this incorrectly, but Sibylla asked, are there further resources you would recommend for those of us who are very new to sharing circles?
Any Oh, okay. Yes, I actually have a ton. I have some on my presentation. So I have like Marie Kovach's, I think that's how you say it, Kovach, her Sharing Circles book. I don't remember exactly the name of the title, but if you look up Kovach Sharing Circles 2009, an incredible resource. That was, I think, one of the first books I bought, and such a great resource. Linda T. Wall Smith's Decolonizing Methodologies has some sharing circle. Something I don't think I shared too much in the presentation, but the last name is Ticini. I'll write it in the chat. Her name is Amanda Ticini. She's out in Arizona. Amazing person. I like fangirled over her at ARA one year, our educational conference, but her work is something that I really utilize for sharing circles. She has a specific article from 2016, just talking about the methodology, and then she also has a study in 2017 that's actually on university students belonging, where she utilized sharing circles, and I use that as a model, in my work. So those are a couple that I would definitely look into. And then if you have relationships with the tribal group or you're from that tribal group or anything like that, I definitely encourage you to have conversations with people. Like I said, in my culture, we call them talking circles, and that's what's been in our culture and history for years. And so that also helped me kind of conceptualize what I was looking for. Oh, yay. Thank you, Charlotte.
I hope that's correct. Can you let me know if that's correct?
Yes, let me click on it and then I will answer the next question.
Perfect.
Um, yes, yes, that's right. Great book. Perfect.
So
Thank you.
Jacqueline, we'll do Jacqueline first and then go back to Sarah.
Okay.
Jacqueline asked, do you feel this research approach is about healing or about knowledge or about both? And if so, in what ways? How is this contributing to the community or decolonizing?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of layers to sharing circles, which is really fun. I think that this approach is about healing. Whenever you come together in a circle and you're sharing vulnerable, whatever the topic is, you're becoming vulnerable. You're talking about yourself, you're talking about experiences or stories that you may have. And so I think that really approaches healing, but it also approaches decolonizing. So unweaving, unstructuring, dismantling these structures that have been around us for so many years and really standing up to them. I also just think it was a space for students to truly feel heard and like their voice mattered. I think that especially in the context that I was in, these students have been being overlooked. They're not taken seriously. They're considered problems when they speak up. And I think all of us have probably felt that way in some degree, in some space. And so really just giving them the chance to like let's talk. Let's just have a conversation. And sometimes, I will be honest, it got off topic a little bit. And do we have to rein back in eventually? Of course, they're middle and high schoolers, and we all like to yap and get off topic. But I really do feel like this methodology really contributes to healing. And then by the essence of it contributing to healing, it then generated knowledge. So we're talking about any experience that we're sharing, any story is knowledge. And I think that has been something that I've really been trying to bring into the field of ed psych and academia in general, is that knowledge does not just come from people who hold a lot of titles or have theories or anything like that. That stories are knowledge, experiences are knowledge, anything is knowledge, really, when we think about it. And so I think that it contributes that way, and then it really contributes to the community by just whatever the product of that methodology is, the point of it is to like contribute to the community. So when you're doing this research, like your community is your number one goal in it, and then whatever comes after is like a bonus. Okay, and then Sarah's question. I hope that answered your question, Jacqueline. Sarah, what sorts of data analysis are aligned with or help capture sharing circles? Ooh, I like this one. I tried to search for like an indigenous data analysis and I didn't find too much. I also probably didn't spend as much time as I should have on it. Um, I personally use semantic analysis. I go by Broad and Clark's 5 or 6 step iterative process with that. Love it. I think that it was really helpful. So I started out by just re-listening to the sharing circles without doing any data analysis, just so I could put myself back in that space. And then after I re-listened to it, I then listened to it again and I transcribed it myself. It's a lot of work, but I find using services, one, you just have to go edit them anyway, so it's a little bit frustrating. But then I also just felt like by being in it and like listening to it line by line really helped me understand it. And then, identifying different codes and subcodes and then turning those, yes, 2006 into themes was really, really helpful for me personally. So I've used semantic analysis. So I'm in the middle of my comprehensive exams right now, and one of my questions is about narrative inquiry. I'm very intrigued by narrative inquiry and how that can relate to Indigenous methodologies. And I've been looking at like narrative analysis. So I think narrative analysis could also be really good for sharing circles because essentially sharing circles is a narrative. It's a narrative of people's experiences. So haven't used that one yet, but definitely I would recommend that. Oh, yay, an update. Okay.
I had a question about and maybe this is coming from my, what I'm comfortable with in terms of like focus group methodologies. And you sort of touched on this when you were talking about how sometimes you get carried away in the conversations with your students or you're with your participants. And I think one of the great things about this sharing circle methodology is this almost like release of power in terms of I'm the researcher and I'm the like asker of questions and I'm asking you to share your stuff, but not that reciprocality that you're including. So I find that to be really compelling, but I'm curious about how that looks on more of a practical sense of typically in like interviews, we come in with a set of questions and we have them all written down. And so is that still a process that you incorporate? Or is it just a lot more of a flexible process? I'm just curious what that approach looks like for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for your question. So I personally came in with a set of questions that I had that I wanted to know. I tried my best not to have them like sitting in front of me or like on a paper and try to just kind of like remember them, but I did have them like nearby to refer to kind of take away that like that power, what I talked about, like clipboards and stuff like that. I don't know why I have such a hate for clipboards, but like that was just like my problem, I guess. Um, but so I did have some questions, but I found that like starting off with just like a very broad question, as we weave through the conversation, we answered every single question. And that will not happen every time, but I was able to kind of guide the conversation. So I think like one of the first questions was like, hey, like, how do you define belonging? Like, what does belonging mean to you? And then as students would say, oh, belonging to me is like when my teacher really like, when she takes part in my language, and they're like, oh, tell me more about that. And then so I'd be like, oh yeah, our language class here at school is like this or it's like this or it's like that. And so I call it like the same thing as like we call semi-structured interviews. Like I had a semi-structure, but I really let the conversation guide itself. And I tried not to beat myself up about if we didn't hit everything. Because sometimes in conversations, especially if you want to keep that flow and it more flexible, you're not going to hit everything every time. So I just try to give myself grace with that. But I did have like a structure. I just was very loose with it.
Other questions, thoughts? We've got a few minutes left. We could probably answer one or two more.
Yes, and I will my slides are I can share them. I saw something was mentioned about that. I can share them and then Sarah just shoot me an email. It's on my slides. We can absolutely chat.
Sorry, I'm at a research site, so if there's background noise, I apologize. Just let me know. I have a question about recruiting collaborators or participants. I'm just curious how you structured your invitations, or I consider them, I know some people call it different things, but I'm curious how you structured those or how you are bringing in folks to join you in your story circles
Yeah,
or
absolutely.
sharing circles, sorry, minor
No,
story
you're
circles.
fine. No, you're fine. Any like name is fine. So I have a couple different this one's a little tough because there's a couple different situations. So with the students in the schools, so there was like layers of invitations almost. So at first it was just I was just having I like approached the education director in my community who I personally knew, who's also obtained a PhD in education. I was just like, hey, I would really like, this is like my, I'm really interested in this. Like, what does a community need? Is there any way that, like, I was approaching my master's thesis and I needed to do a project and I really wanted to do something that would really help my community instead of just something that, it's just like a one and done thing here at Penn State. And so I approached her and we had a conversation and then she's like, you need to meet with these people. So then she connected me with those people. And then it was the same thing of just like, hey, can we just have a conversation about this? It's like, what do you need? What are you thinking? And then we realized his name's Al actually, that we actually like a lot of our ideas converge and we're like thinking the same things. And so he's like, I'd love for to do this with you. I'd love for you to do this. So it definitely like all started on the basis of a relationship and creating more relationships. And I think the biggest thing is that never go into a community saying, I want to do this. Can like go in there saying, what can I do for you? Or like, hey, like I'm doing a PhD in this and I'd love to like help out. I'm very interested. Or even just start it with like, hey, I'd just like to know more about the community and things like that. And then for participants, it was a little different because I didn't recruit the participants, the enhancement staff recruited them. So essentially, I told enhancement in the school like what we were doing once it was approved by everyone, by the principals of the school. So I had a conversation with them, the community directors, all that. Once it was all approved, then the enhancement staff they were in the schools and just like, hey, you want to come here during fourth period? Da, da, da. And of course, the students are like, free food, no class, and a gift card. Sign me up. So a lot of it was that. And then obviously they did share, like I had a blurb about, this is what we're going to be talking about. And then once the students learned what it was about, they were like, definitely sign me up because I have a lot to say and I haven't been heard. So it was a little bit different. But when I did this with the wellness in the library, I definitely framed the question or like the sharing circles as like, this is a space, and it is this way. This is a space where you get to be heard. And it's not just, I'm not just going to ask you questions, like, we're going to have a conversation. And, as I jump into my dissertation work, I'm not doing sharing circles, but I am doing interviews. And I hate to even call them that because I'm trying to put a twist on like sharing circles as an interview, like a sharing interview. I don't know what I'm going to call it, where it's like truly a conversation between me and the participant. I want to get them coffee or, a bagel or whatever they like and just have a conversation with them and kind of strip down that power of like, I'm the researcher, you're the participant, and let's just talk and explain our experiences. And of course, there's always going to be the power no matter what. I'm coming in, I'm doing a research story, no matter what, there's always going to be some power, but just trying to strip that down as much as possible is my goal. You're welcome. Yes, okay, cool.
Okay, I think we could go ahead and wrap up. I'm not sure if there's quite time for another question, but um, soon to be Dr. Bowman, we appreciate this so much. This was so wonderful. Thank you so much. We are very, very grateful for your time and you sharing your knowledge with us. This was so, so great. I do have a few quick announcements. So as Corey was mentioning, this is the last talk in our summer session, but please be on the lookout for talks in the fall. I do want to mention that at APA on August 7th, there will be an amazing tour of an art museum in Denver. I'm going to put the exhibit here. It is beautiful indigenous art. It's called Sustained. And we currently have spots for 40 people. So you all should definitely register if you're interested. Again, it's Thursday, August 7th. During APA, the tour will be at 3:30 p.m. and then there will be a reception at 5:30 p.m. So we hope to see you there. I think that's it, Macy. Thank you so much. Please be on the lookout for upcoming talks. I hope everyone's having a great summer. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Take care.